Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. We are into the first chapter in metaethics, the chapter on ethical relativism. It is chapter 19 in your text, starting page 291. And what I'd like to do is get right into our slides so that you are prepared for this week's quiz. So what we're going to do is break up metaethics over a span of 3 weeks so that we have enough time to devote to each of the subjects, which are some of the more difficult parts of doing ethical philosophy. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our time through this stuff, but I hope to keep the presentation short. So let me get started with the actual slide deck here, and we will get right to it. So, just as a reminder that your author puts in bold key terms that you will need to refer to and to know inside and out, really, backwards and forwards. And they're in the glossary, but he also does a nice job of making sure to define them very clearly where they first appear, and that's where they're in bold. So do make sure you pause over those definitions and know them. Okay, so we want to get to, first of all, we want to set the backdrop against which ethical relativism is expressed. And it's in reaction to sort of the natural position of ethical objectivism. And we find this in, we find ethical objectivism not necessarily fleshed out as a theory, but mainly as the default position that people have. And it's manifested in the way we talk about behavior and moral rules and things like that, where we express them as, well, these apply to everyone. Occasionally, of course, with qualifications. But ethical objectivism, then, is kind of the default position, but it also is challenged by many of the things that we're going to be talking about in metaethics. And so what we're going to do is talk about ethical relativism today, and it is the view that some moral standards or principles are objectively correct and some moral claims are objectively true. So that's ethical objectivism, just to be clear. And so I think it's going to be important for us to understand what we mean by objectivity. And you need to understand what that term means. So the opposite of objectivity is subjectivity. And so what objectivity means is that the claim, the fact, the state of affairs, the principle, the standard, the law, whatever, is something that is mind independent. In other words, its reality, its truth, is not dependent on an individual mind, but that its truth is made. How do I put this? When you, let's say, take a scientific law, okay, what makes the scientific law true? Well, certain states of affairs in the world, certain kinds of evidence serve as truth makers for that natural law. And so the idea in ethical objectivism is that there would be moral laws then that are universal and that are not dependent on the subject's understanding or approval or anything like that, but that there's some truth-making feature in the world, in the moral world, in the ethical universe, however you want to describe it, that is a truth maker for that moral law. Okay, now this is not the language of your text, but I'm just trying to make it clear, underscore what it means for something to be objective, okay? The property of objectivity. So in contrast to that, you have the property of subjectivity, and a subject is first and foremost a mind, a thinking, feeling, wishing, desiring individual. Okay, so that's a subject, someone who is who asserts their will, who makes choices, decisions. So all of that would mean then that if ethical laws, if moral laws are subjective, that means they are dependent on a mind. Okay, so that's all that means. Now, let's look at how Schaefer-Landau describes objectivity. So he he defines it this way. Moral standards are objective if they apply to everyone, even if people don't believe they do, even if people are indifferent to them, and even if obeying them fails to satisfy anyone's desires. Okay, so he gives you some examples of some things like, oh, you know, how many moons does Jupiter have? Or, not that, that's not correct. Let's say Ganymede is a moon of Jupiter. Okay, whether I am ignorant of that fact, or whether I don't believe it if you tell me that, or whether I really don't care, whether it doesn't really do anything for me, is irrelevant to the question of whether it's objectively true. Okay, whether that's an objective truth. So what do? We check the universe, we check the evidence, and then we find out that there is some state of affairs that is truth-making for that claim. Namely, that there is indeed a moon around Jupiter that has been named Ganymede for probably 400 years now. So that is, in a nutshell, then, the definition of objectivity. Okay? And so the idea there is that just as there are objective truths in nature, so there are objective truths in the moral world as well. Now, that is not an obviously true claim. So objective moral truths is certainly more contestable than the idea of say, physical or material or natural truths, right? So there are good reasons to doubt this. One is that there's no sort of acid test that we would appeal to determine whether that truth maker indeed satisfies the claim. You know what? Okay, the flip side of a truth maker is a truth bearer. So are moral claims and moral judgments legitimate bearers of moral truths or not? Okay, good question. Well, be that as it may, what we are going to do is we're going to look at some of these objections to moral objectivism through this section on metaethics, and it'll conclude with 11 arguments against moral objectivism. We'll sum it all up, and we will still see some of the problems then with those challenges to moral objectivism. So I want you to understand that these 3 chapters on metaethics are setting the groundwork for showing how moral objectivism is still supported and has the force of very strong arguments against its challengers. Okay, so we'll be looking at that. All right. So, what is moral skepticism then? Well, it's the denial of ethical objectivism. Obviously, that's what you're doing. If you're a moral skeptic, you're saying, I don't think that moral objectivism is true. That is, there are going to be 2 forms of this. Moral skepticism is just a descriptive term, but there are more fleshed out versions of this, and we need to talk about those. So there are 2 of them. Moral nihilism is the first of them. So moral nihilism is the view that there are no moral truths at all. Okay, so they would answer the question, well, what's the truth maker for this moral claim or judgment that you're making? And the nihilist will say, there is no truth maker for that. There's no legitimate statement that is a truth bearer for your moral judgment or claim, because there are no moral truths that would satisfy those claims. Okay, so that your author talks about what gets going here, and so just consider the consequences if you accept the moral nihilist position, is that it would undermine our attempts to say that what seem to be obvious moral evils, that it is inappropriate, it's illegitimate to call them such, like genocide or apartheid. Okay, if moral objectivism, sorry, that's not quite right. If moral nihilism is true, then we are simply disguising some other kind of feeling that we have. We're venting when we say that genocide is wrong or evil. we're not actually stating something that can be true or false. So that's a consequence of moral nihilism. So that's you'll find this theme, by the way, in each of the positions we're going to talk about, and that is this idea of expressivism, that moral claims, moral judgments, moral laws are expressing some inner feeling, some disposition one might have, some attitudes that a culture might have, or those kinds of things. So they're expressing those kinds of subjective kinds of experiences, feelings, and so on, wishes, rather than saying something about the world itself. Okay? So hope that's helped. That's called expressivism. You don't have to know that, by the way. That's just that's a bonus. Okay, the other form of moral skepticism, then, is ethical relativism. And so this is the idea that, hey, there are moral truths, but they're relative to each other in some way, whether relative to each person or relative to different cultures or societies. So we're going to look at that as well. And that position, ethical relativism, is further broken down into two other forms. So we're going to set moral nihilism aside, and we will be talking about that more in Chapter 20. So we'll hit the pause button on moral nihilism. We're going to move into ethical relativism now and dig into that, since that is our chapter. Okay. So the two forms are ethical subjectivism and cultural relativism. So we're going to talk about, first of all, ethical subjectivism. Your author gives a nice summary of the position on page 293. So have a look at this very carefully stated definition. An act is morally acceptable just because A, I approve it, or B, my commitments allow it. So in other words, I approve it means I endorse it, I sanction it. B means it's permissible according to my convictions. Okay? Again, notice how that is expressing something about me, the subject, and not saying something about the world. Okay, so an action is wrong then, on the flip side, just because A, I disapprove of it, or B, my commitments forbid it. Okay, before we move into cultural relativism, so just notice here that the subjectivist, actually, let me just come back to that. Subjectivist thinks that, there are right answers in ethics, but that these are always going to be relative to an individual person's values. There's no sort of objective code or law that you can appeal to external to the subject and say, let me look that up, let me check that. There's nothing against which we can measure the accuracy of moral claims, of moral judgments, of a person's moral outlook. So that's kind of crucial here, and it makes, and I'll just sort of put this marker down as something to look for in this discussion, and that is that if subjectivism is correct, that means each person's moral standards are equally plausible. Let that sink in for a second. It's easy to sort of embrace that for yourself and for people that you admire and like, but it gets a little troublesome when you start thinking about some of the people that you, let's just keep it expressive, you dislike or you disapprove of in the world, and to say that their moral standards are equally valid and plausible, do you really want to own that? That's one of the consequences, then, of the ethical subjectivist position. Okay, so we're going to say more about that, but let's move to the second form of ethical relativism, that's cultural relativism. And so now, instead of looking at the individual subject, we're looking at subject now as a group of people, a society or a culture. So in cultural relativism, it says that an act is morally acceptable just because it is allowed by the guiding ideals of the society in which it is performed, and immoral just because it is forbidden by those ideals. So let me see if there's anything I wanted to add to that. That one is pretty clear. You can see how that is sort of an extension of ethical subjectivism. Let's see. So yeah, it comes down to the difference between these two is who ultimately has the final say when it comes to moral standards. Is it the subject, the individual subject, or is it a society or a culture? That's the main difference between them. That's the main distinction. But both of these views share a number of features that make it easy to evaluate them together. So what we're going to do is we're going to take cultural relativism, we're going to take subjectivism, and we're going to pack them together and look at the implications of the views taken just together as ethical relativism. Okay? So, problem number 1 is moral infallibility. If ethical truth is determined by personal opinion or cultural ideals, then it is impossible for one's personal ethical opinions or culture's ideals to ever be mistaken. In other words, the individual is infallible, cannot err. A culture is infallible, can never err. Because of this, if ethical relativism is true, the moral views of all individuals or all cultures are equally good. That's the marker I laid down earlier. And if you think about, let's take cultural relativism, for example, we can look at, say, South Africa in the early to mid and even later 20th century had a policy of apartheid. So it was that society's view that it was a positive good to discriminate on the base of race and to have inferior resources and facilities for those who were not in the favored race. So now, if you're a cultural relativist, you're going to have a difficult time trying to explain what's wrong with that. After all, they're the final say, right, of which moral standards are valid. A similar example is given in, not similar example, but the same kind of idea is expressed in your text on page 294 to 295. Talks about the example of honor killings. And another example of the difficulties with cultural relativism. So you take a look at that, and then you start unpacking some of these difficult and historically accurate examples where whole cultures or whole societies, our tendency is to condemn them for those practices, just like, say, practice of institutional slavery in the United States. For the better part of its history, we stand in position now where we condemn that, right? On what grounds, though? So if you take cultural relativist position, it's important then to unpack the assumptions, the cultural assumptions behind some of those things, and then it becomes maybe even more obvious, what exactly, morally speaking, you're biting off there. And so, what about the idea of racial superiority? So if you accept that a culture like the United States and others, which allows institutional slavery, even the law of the land, that you are saying that it is supported by this assumption that people of one race, the whites, ought to be able to restrict the freedoms and lives of those of other races. So that's one of the assumptions, that there's nothing wrong with that. That those of other races, of non-white races, must obey whatever the white man says. You're also accepting that assumption, and others, but that's just a couple to give you some idea then. And I picked institutional slavery, and that's a difficult one to sort of connect with, maybe, because it is deeper in our past. I mean, we still obviously feel the effects of it and are suffering the effects of it, but it would be different if we looked at something that is an ongoing practice. And so that's why I think the force of the honor killings example is helpful there, where you start to sort of unpack what the assumptions are behind that, like sexism, that there's nothing wrong with sexism, that men are entitled to have a full authority over the bodies and lives of women, and that it's justifiable for a man to kill a woman on the basis of shame. So if you look at that example, then it might help to understand how it becomes then impossible to criticize a culture if you take the cultural relativism position. Well, there may be a way out, but we'll get to that in a minute. So it should be enough, though, to challenge the plausibility of cultural relativism if we point to things like that. Okay, so it is this sort of bigotry and ethnic cleansing and sexism, all those kinds of things, making them morally okay seems to be a deeply troublesome effect of ethical relativism. And so, that raises doubts then about cultural relativism in this case, right? So, and it's even worse than that, because not only would things like, genocide or racism or sexism or bigotry, not only would they be morally permissible in the societies, that are based in those assumptions, they would become duties for the members of that society. In other words, you would be wrong not to do these things if you were a member of that society. That's taking it to another level. But that's one of the consequences then. And so then what you have then is, the person who, let's say within that society, you have somebody who is challenging the status quo, is challenging those assumptions. They will always be morally wrong. They would be morally mistaken. And so that too seems implausible. Okay, so subjectivism has a similar kind of problem, and you can see then how this problem of moral infallibility then sets up a real difficulty. Is that, especially with the subject at the subjective level, because there, whatever is the basis for one's moral principles, whether it's prejudice, whether it is ignorance, whether it's superficiality, whether it's brainwashing, whatever is the basis for the moral conviction that one has, it will still be correct, right? There's no need to appeal to reasons. There's no need to appeal to reasonableness because the origins of those basic principles are irrelevant. It doesn't really matter how we got them. The fact is that they are unassailable, right? They are infallible if we have them. Okay, so I think I've probably beat that one to death, but that's a really major consequence then, moral infallibility. And we just talked about why that would be a problem. Okay, next. So then we have the problem of moral equivalence. So we could have, take two positions, all right? Well, let's just stick to genocide, right? So I can have, I have people who are, who in a culture are in favor of genocidal practices, and I have people who are opposed to them, and then how do we say which position is worse or better? Well, we can't, because one of the consequences of ethical relativism is their moral equivalence of those convictions. Okay? Now, the cultural relativist is going to deny that everyone's individual moral views are equally plausible. So they at least allow that there is some difference in moral status, right? And that would be dependent on things like, somebody's reasonableness, or, somebody who is just wiser, has maybe a better grasp of what the society's principles are than another person within that society. So there can be difference there. But when you're talking about the actual code, moral code within the society, you're not going to be able to compare one code against another, because they will be morally equivalent then. So you can, it can sound really open-minded to say, oh, who am I to judge, a society that conducts human sacrifice? Who am I to judge that? I mean, our culture has problems too, and that may make me feel good to be, so open-minded that I would accept a culture that I would approve of a culture that commits human sacrifice, but I would be buying into things that I actually would find morally repugnant then, and not being willing to criticize them or to challenge them. So, moral equivalence then, things like, hey, women are property in the code of this one society. Who am I to judge? Who am I to judge? If cultural relativism is true, if ethical relativism is true, maybe I'm not able to judge that, or at least not consistently, not without being contradicting my own claim to be a relativist. Okay, so if one of the effects then is that we don't have any basis for asking whether we should value one thing over another, we really can't be wrong. We're right because we take it to be right. So the importance there is, we would, just coming back for a second, what we want to be able to do, and because we've seen this as part of sort of moral growth, both in an individual and a culture, maybe even globally, is that if it's not possible to question our own commitments, our own moral convictions, if it's just not possible to do that because it makes no sense to do it, then whatever I approve of is always going to be right. It's not worthwhile to challenge or question those commitments. And that's kind of odd, because I think probably most of us are familiar with being in a situation where you're not quite sure, morally speaking, what the right thing to do is. Maybe it involves something like trust. Should I trust this person? There's no wrong answer to that for the subjectivist. So this idea of being able to question and challenge one's own convictions, that's an important step. It seems to be. And that's the same problem is faced in cultural relativism as well. Where will we ever second guess ourselves? If we are, if the moral codes that we have are across cultures are equivalent, morally equivalent. There's no real distinction between them. It's just differences in practice. Okay, so another consequence, important consequence, is the lack of, well, not the lack, it's the impossibility of moral progress. Moral views can change, but we can't say they improve. Why? Well, because if you talk about evaluating term like improve or degrade, you're then talking about some sort of standard against which you're measuring that improvement or that degradation. You're appealing to some criterion And that doesn't exist in ethical relativism. You know, outside an objective one, where you could say, as a third-party observer, an anthropologist say, and you could look at a society and, you know, observe it over time and say, oh, wow, they've made more progress. No, you would never say that, because you have no standard against which to measure it. Right. Let's see if there's anything else I want to mention about that. And so, yeah, think about the consequences of that. Then, you know, take Germany. Germany has repudiated its earlier ideals during the Nazi period of racial purity and of performing genocide on the Jews. And so they repudiated that. They no longer practice that. But what we're not allowed to say then is that that constitutes any sort of moral progress. That seems really implausible. Hard to believe. But that's one of the consequences. So there is, I think that's the, that is the main ones that I wanted to mention and that your author talks about. So moral infallibility, this is the implications. Moral infallibility, moral equivalence, the inability to question our own convictions, and moral progress. Okay. Let's see. Yes, and now the last of the implications is how easily these positions generate contradictions. So this starts on page 298, and your author goes into several examples that are very, very helpful. So look closely at this section 298 through 300. So yeah, example, you know, according to ethical relativism, you can have a pro-life person and a pro-choice person both be right at the same time, and that's a contradiction. There are other ones. So what typically happens is that the relativists will make the move to expressivism and say things like, oh, okay, when you say that you're a pro-life person, you're saying that abortion is immoral. What you're actually saying is that you disapprove of abortion. Okay, and so the response would be, by the pro-life person, would be, yeah, I do disapprove of abortion, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm not talking about my attitudes toward abortion. I'm talking about abortion. So the expressivist, according to the moral objectivist, is changing the subject. So the same thing with pro-choice. Okay, so the subjectivists would say, okay, what I'm hearing you say is that you disapprove of restrictions on abortion, or something to that effect, or you approve of the practice of abortion. And the response would be, by the moral objectivist, is, yeah, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the justice of the right, the choice to have access to abortion, and the code that goes around that, right? So again, talking about whether someone approves or disapproves of a practice is changing the subject. That's one way to understand what's going on when the relativist makes the expressivist move. Okay. So, well, what's the big deal? So what it generates contradictions? Well, contradictions are good reason to disregard or to find a theory implausible. So if ethical relativism generates contradictions, that's a good reason to say, okay, well, there's something wrong with ethical relativism. That is probably not true. So let me see if there's another thing. Yeah, a lot of it is talking about expressivism and how the attempt to escape the contradiction by the relativist is to make the expressivist move. And so you just have to be on your guard against that. So if you take summing that up is This is the expressivist view here. So if you take moral claims at face value, then subjectivism, ethical relativism is going to generate contradictions, and so it has to be false. But if you reinterpret the moral claims to be focused on our attitudes, our feelings, then the contradictions disappear. But then so does the moral disagreement. So then you're put in the position of saying, oh yeah, well the pro-life and the pro-choice positions, there's no real disagreement there. Okay, that's just crazy. So that's a dilemma then for the relativist. They're going to have to do something about that that consequence of the fact that their theory generates contradictions. Okay. And I have already talked over this slide, so I don't think we need to go any further there. And so let's talk then about how they overcome the problem of and the dilemma that they generate. And the most, I mean, there are different strategies to try to do that, but the strategy that is the one that your author focuses on the most is the ideal observer strategy. And so this page is 303. It goes right to the end. And so what you have then, and if you, and your author makes a point that there's a similar kind of move in social contract theory. Don't worry about that. The ideal observer is fully informed and a perfectly rational version of themselves. So what this move does is it allows us to say that, oh yeah, moral views are complicated, and people are a mess of contradiction. Morally speaking, lots of people are flawed, and warts and all. So those are the real disagreements and the real moral problems and questions, right? So what we're going to do to solve that is we're going to not talk about the real observers. We're going to talk about an ideal observer, somebody who is fully informed and a perfectly rational version of yourself. Okay. If then, so that there's a condition placed on the moral rightness or wrongness of a given action. That is that if I am fully informed and perfectly rational, then I would favor an act. If I favor an act, then it's morally right. Okay, and if I disapprove of an act, then it's morally wrong. Okay, that's only if though I'm fully informed and perfectly rational. Okay, so that's the condition that's set up for the ideal observer. Okay, so there's some real improvements then to relativism if the ideal observer idea is right, if that strategy works. And just to name a few ones we were just talking about, it allows for moral fallibility, moral progress, moral disagreement, and the notion that some moral views are better than others. That's quite an improvement. And you need to check this out on pages 304, 305, so where your author goes to explain how the ideal observer position allows these improvements. Okay, so do have a look then on those pages for that. The problem though is that it doesn't necessarily solve the problem of disagreement at the level of the ideal observer. Okay, and so what we then have are is it possible then that a rational and perfectly informed version of an evil person is going to be someone who then supports and thinks that, say, cruelty and hate is the most rational, well-informed attitude or policy or actions to take. So then that would obviously be opposed to the ideal observer who is who takes the different view. And so the evil people are not necessarily not necessarily motivated by ignorance or prejudice. They could simply be rational and logical skill is no guarantee of moral superiority. They could be coldly logical and yet be hateful, biased, cruel people. There are plenty of examples scattered throughout history to demonstrate that. Okay, so now we have the problem here is that because nothing is intrinsically right, things become right because the ideal observer supports it. But which sounds good for me, because hey, I'm nice. But what about these evil people who are not? Maybe killing off mentally ill people is a great idea. Okay, what if they approve of apartheid policies? So that is then the problem, is that because the relativists cannot say that apartheid policies are intrinsically wrong or based on intrinsically wrong convictions or assumptions. Now you've stepped up the moral disagreement to the level of between ideal observers. Okay. So yeah, we can ask then, so the problem is that we are asserting this idea as a relativist that an action or policy its rightness comes from the fact that I happen to favor it as an ideal observer. Okay, that seems incorrect. So if I don't have reasons for why I favor it, then it's not my say-so that actually explains why the action is right. If I don't have reasons for them, then my favoring it is arbitrary. Okay, so there's the dilemma. Either reasons are what makes an action right, or they aren't. So let me see if there was anything I wanted to add to that. Yeah. So, the cost of saying that nothing is morally right or wrong in and of itself is this issue then, that their rightness and wrongness depends on my favoring them or disapproving of them, or my society's favoring them or disapproving of them. But then I would approve of them if we were perfectly intelligent. But then how does that happen? How do I take something that has no intrinsic value and then all of a sudden it becomes good or right simply because I favor it? Yeah. So let's see if there's anything else I want to add. Sorry, that was kind of a tortured discussion there. I guess the bottom line is, let me see if I've got another thing. Yeah, there's the, sorry, I get behind on the slides because I'm talking too much. But that's the priority problem is what I was just describing. So if you back the ideal observer's moral verdicts, then if you have reasons for backing them, then it's the reasons that make the acts right or wrong. Okay, not because the ideal observer favors them. That was the advantage of it to begin with, right? The ideal observer view is we just had to look at that individual and find what they approved of and what they disapproved of, and then we would know what's right and wrong. But no, if they have good reasons to back their verdicts, then it's those reasons that make acts right or wrong. If there are no good reasons to back the verdicts of the ideal observers, then we have no obligation to obey their verdicts. We're back to where we were before we had the ideal observer strategy. Okay, let me see, by way of conclusion here. Let me see. Yeah, I think so. So, there, just to sum up then, cultural relativism, ethical subjectivism, these forms of ethical relativism are popular ways of challenging the idea that morality is objective. You run into it all the time. You may have expressed these ideas yourself. But, I hope you see as you read through this chapter that both the theories face some serious and a similar set of problems. They make all moral views or all social codes morally equivalent. They make the deepest commitments of each person or each society morally infallible, can do no wrong, even if the commitments are based on ignorance or prejudice. That's an odd thing. Or brainwashing, for that matter. Neither theory offers a way to evaluate our guiding ideals, since these ideals are said to be true by definition. Neither theory allows for fundamental moral progress. Both theories generate contradictions and can eliminate this worry only by making moral disagreement impossible. That's the ideal observer move, which is explained here why the priority problem is then what makes the moral disagreement impossible. Okay, so this hopefully will explain to you why moral philosophers, find ethical subjectivism, cultural relativism to be not very plausible positions to have, and as many doubts as philosophers might have about moral objectivism. These alternatives don't seem to hold much promise. Now we'll come back to this in chapter 21, but for the next time we're going to look at another alternative that might have more to offer, and that's the moral nihilist. And so we'll take a look at that in chapter 20. And so until then, I will see you later.